LaGuardia, 2026. On March 22, 2026, a fire truck was cleared to cross an active runway at New York's LaGuardia Airport. Seconds later, an Air Canada jet slammed into it at over 90 miles per hour. The cockpit was severed on impact, and both pilots were killed instantly. Air Canada Flight 8646, a Bombardier CRJ-900 carrying 72 passengers and 4 crew from Montreal, had just touched down on runway 4 shortly before midnight. At the same time, a Port Authority fire rescue truck had been given permission to cross that same runway. It was responding to something completely unrelated, a bad smell on a United flight. The air traffic controller had cleared both the landing and the crossing. Then, seconds too late, he realized what he'd done. The tower recordings captured the controller screaming at the truck to stop 6 times, but it was already too late. The jet hit the middle of the vehicle at between 93 and 105 miles per hour. The nose of the aircraft was destroyed. A flight attendant was found outside the plane, still strapped to her seat. She survived. Her daughter called it a total miracle. 41 people were taken to hospitals. 2 Port Authority officers in the truck suffered broken limbs. Passengers described being thrown from their seats, bleeding, and helping each other slide down a wing to escape. 20 minutes after the crash, the controller's voice came back on the recording. "We were dealing with an emergency earlier," he said. "I messed up." LaGuardia shut down for 14 hours. The NTSB launched an investigation. The FAA confirmed it was examining whether understaffing in the tower played a role, a problem that has plagued American airports for years. 1 cleared landing, 1 cleared crossing, same runway and same moment. That's all it took. Eastern Airlines 401, 1972. A $12 light bulb killed 101 people, not because it exploded, because the pilots couldn't stop staring at it. On December 29, 1972, Eastern Airlines Flight 401, a brand new Lockheed TriStar carrying 176 people, was descending into Miami when the crew lowered the landing gear. Everything went down, but one tiny green light, the one confirming the nose gear was locked, didn't turn on. The gear was fine, but the bulb was burned out, and nobody knew that yet. Captain Robert Loft told the tower they were aborting the approach and requested a holding pattern over the Everglades at 2,000 feet. Then all 3 crew members focused entirely on that one light. They pulled the assembly out. They tried to reseat it, but it jammed. The flight engineer climbed down beneath the cockpit to visually check the gear, but it was too dark to see, and nobody had switched on the wheel well light. While all 3 men stared at a bulb, nobody was flying the plane. At some point, someone bumped the control yoke. The autopilot silently switched from altitude hold to a mode that let the aircraft descend. No alarm they would notice. It was pitch black over the Everglades, no city lights, no horizon, and nothing to tell them they were sinking. For 4 minutes, the plane drifted downward. An altitude warning chimed once from a speaker near the empty flight engineer's seat, and nobody heard it. The first officer finally glanced at his instruments. "We did something to the altitude," he said. The captain's last words, "Hey, what's happening here?" 7 seconds later, the left wing hit the swamp at 227 miles per hour. 101 people died. 75 survived, many because the swamp mud absorbed the impact. The landing gear had been locked and working the entire time. Linati, 2001. The ground controller couldn't find the plane on his map. That's because the marking it was sitting on didn't exist on any map in the building. On October 8, 2001, thick fog blanketed Milan's Linati Airport. The visibility was less than 200 meters. A Cessna Citation business jet carrying 4 people was taxiing for a flight to Paris. The controller told the pilots to take taxiway R5, looping safely around the main runway, but they took R6 instead. The taxiway markings were faded and non-compliant. In the fog, the pilots couldn't tell which path was which. They followed the only green light they could see, and it led them straight toward the active runway. When they reached a holding point marked S4, they reported their position. The controller had no idea what S4 was. It wasn't on his map. It wasn't on any map in the tower. It was an old marking left on the asphalt from construction years earlier that nobody had removed. He assumed the pilots were somewhere safe and cleared them to continue. They rolled directly onto runway 36R. At that same moment, Scandinavian Airlines Flight 686, an MD-87 carrying 110 people to Copenhagen, was accelerating for takeoff. The jet hit the Cessna at 270 kilometers per hour. The right engine and landing gear were ripped off. The pilots got the plane 35 feet into the air for 12 seconds before it fell back, skidded off the runway, and slammed into a baggage hangar. All 114 people on both aircraft died. 4 baggage handlers in the hangar were killed. One survived with burns over 80% of his body. The airport's ground radar, brand new, purchased just 7 years earlier, had never been turned on. The runway sensors had been deactivated because they kept going off when hairs ran across the tarmac. 118 people, a faded sign, a phantom map marking, and a radar that nobody bothered to switch on. Concorde, 2000. A piece of metal smaller than a ruler destroyed the most iconic aircraft ever built. On July 25, 2000, a Continental Airlines DC-10 took off from Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris and lost a strip of titanium from its engine housing. The strip was about 43 centimeters long, roughly the length of a kitchen knife. It landed on runway 26R. Nobody noticed. Nobody picked it up. 5 minutes later, Air France Flight 4590, a Concorde carrying 100 passengers on a charter to New York, began its takeoff roll down the same runway. At 300 kilometers per hour, the Concorde's left tire hit the strip and exploded. A 4.5-kilogram chunk of rubber launched upward into the underside of the wing at 500 kilometers per hour. It didn't puncture the fuel tank directly. It sent a shockwave through it that blew the tank open from the inside. Fuel poured out at 60 liters per second and ignited almost instantly. The pilots had already passed the speed at which takeoff can be safely aborted. They had no choice but to fly. But the fire was consuming the left wing. Engines 1 and 2 lost power. The landing gear jammed and couldn't retract, creating massive drag. The plane struggled to 200 feet but couldn't climb any higher. The crew tried to divert to nearby Le Bourget Airport. The captain's last recorded words were, "It's too late." 90 seconds after the start of the takeoff roll, the Concorde rolled over and crashed into a hotel in the suburb of Gonesse. All 109 people on board died, and 4 people on the ground were killed. The strip of metal that started everything had been installed by a Continental Airlines mechanic days earlier, using titanium instead of the specified stainless steel. It wasn't an approved part, and nobody checked. One strip, one tire, 1 minute and 30 seconds, and the age of supersonic passenger flight was over. Air Florida, 1982. The first officer told the captain something was wrong 3 times, and the captain took off anyway. On January 13, 1982, Washington, D.C. was buried in a blizzard. Washington National Airport had been closed all morning. Air Florida Flight 90, a Boeing 737 carrying 79 people to Fort Lauderdale, was already delayed 2 hours. Snow kept piling on the wings. The crew de-iced the plane, then sat in the taxi line for 49 minutes. By the time they reached the runway, fresh ice had formed on the wings. The captain chose not to go back. He also never switched on the engine anti-ice system, which meant the thrust sensors were feeding false readings to the cockpit. Neither pilot had real experience in snow. The captain had made 8 winter takeoffs, the first officer just 2. During the takeoff roll, the first officer saw the instruments didn't match reality. "Look at that thing," he said. "That don't seem right, does it?" But the captain ignored him. "Nah, I don't think that's right," the first officer repeated. But the captain called out the speeds and kept going. The 737 used half a mile more runway than normal before barely lifting off. It reached 352 feet, then started sinking. The stick shaker fired, warning the crew the plane was about to stall. The captain knew they were falling. The first officer called his name, begging him to do something, but there was nothing left to do. 30 seconds after takeoff, the plane slammed into the 14th Street Bridge over the Potomac, hit 7 vehicles, and plunged through the ice into the freezing river. 78 people died, 74 on the plane and 4 on the bridge. 5 survivors clung to the tail section in water, barely above freezing. One of them, Arlen D. Williams Jr., kept passing the rescue line to others instead of taking it himself, and when the helicopter came back for him, he was gone. Überlingen, 2002. The computer told the pilots to climb. The controller told them to descend. They followed the man, and 71 people died. 52 of them were children. On the night of July 1, 2002, 2 planes were flying at 36,000 feet over southern Germany. Bashkirian Airlines Flight 2937, a Tupolev carrying 69 people from Moscow to Barcelona, 45 of them schoolchildren, and DHL Flight 611, a Boeing 757 cargo jet with 2 pilots flying from Italy to Brussels. They were on a collision course, and the one person who could have stopped it was working alone. Peter Nielsen, the controller at Skyguide in Zurich, was handling 2 workstations by himself. His colleague had gone to sleep. The collision warning system was off for maintenance. The phones were down. Nielsen was distracted by an unrelated flight. He saw the 2 planes converging 43 seconds before impact and told the Tupolev to descend. But at that same moment, TCAS, the automatic collision avoidance system, told the Tupolev to climb and the DHL plane to descend. If both crews had followed the computer, they would have separated safely. The DHL pilots obeyed TCAS and descended, but the Russian crew followed Nielsen and descended too. Both planes were now diving toward the same altitude. 8 seconds before impact, the Russian crew saw the 757 coming from the left. They tried to climb, but it was too late. The planes collided at nearly a right angle. The 757's tail sliced through the Tupolev's fuselage. Both aircraft fell out of the sky. All 71 people died. Many of the children's bodies were found in a field near the crash site. 2 years later, Vitaly Kaloyev, a Russian architect who lost his wife and 2 children in the crash, tracked Nielsen to his home near Zurich and stabbed him to death in front of his family. He served 3 years, and when he returned to Russia, he was treated as a hero. Charkhi Dadri, 1996. Both planes were on the same airway, one going up and one coming down. The controller couldn't see their altitude, and 349 people died. On November 12, 1996, Saudia Flight 763, a Boeing 747 carrying 312 people, took off from Delhi heading to Jeddah. At the same time, Kazakhstan Airlines Flight 1907, an Ilyushin with 37 on board, was descending toward Delhi on the exact same corridor. In 1996, Delhi had only one civilian airway for both arrivals and departures. Planes going up and planes coming down shared the same strip of sky. The controller cleared the 747 to climb to 14,000 feet. He cleared the Kazakh plane to descend to 15,000. 1,000 feet of separation. That was the entire margin. The Kazakh crew reported reaching 15,000, but they hadn't. The flight recorder showed them at 14,500 and still descending. The captain barely spoke English. All communication went through the radio operator, who couldn't see the instrument panel from where he sat. The crew used metric altimeters, meters and kilometers, but Delhi used feet and nautical miles. Whether they misread the altitude or misunderstood the instruction, nobody will ever know. The controller had no way to catch it. Delhi's radar showed distance and direction, but not altitude. He told both crews about the other's position. The Kazakh radio operator acknowledged, "Now looking, 1907. Seconds later, a U.S. Air Force pilot nearby reported a big explosion at his 2 o'clock. The Kazakh plane's wing had sliced through the 747's left wing. The Boeing spiraled and hit the ground at over 1,100 kilometers per hour. The Ilyushin crashed in a field nearby. All 349 people died, the deadliest mid-air collision in aviation history. After the crash, India made collision avoidance systems mandatory on all aircraft, and the rest of the world followed. Tenerife, 1977. 583 dead. The worst aviation disaster in history, and it started with a single misheard word. On March 27, 1977, 2 Boeing 747s, one KLM and one Pan Am, were stuck on the island of Tenerife. Neither was supposed to be there. A bomb at their destination in Gran Canaria had diverted them to Los Rodeos, a tiny airport that couldn't handle them. The tarmac was so packed that planes had to taxi down the runway itself to reach takeoff position. Then the fog came. Visibility dropped below 100 meters. The tower couldn't see either plane. The airport had no ground radar. KLM taxied to the end of the runway and turned around for takeoff. Pan Am followed on the same runway, told to exit at the third taxiway. But the exits were unmarked. The crew missed their turn. They were still on the runway. The KLM captain, Jacob Van Zanten, the airline's chief instructor and most famous pilot, was anxious to leave. His first officer radioed, "We are now at takeoff." The controller replied, "Okay," then added, "Stand by for takeoff, I will call you." But a simultaneous radio call from Pan Am created a squeal of interference that blocked the second half. Van Zanten heard only, "Okay." He then released the brakes. His flight engineer asked, "Is he not clear, that Pan American?" Van Zanten replied, "Oh yes," and he kept going. In the Pan Am cockpit, KLM's lights appeared through the fog dead ahead. Grubbs shoved the throttles forward and yanked the plane left. Van Zanten saw them and pulled back desperately, dragging his tail along the pavement for 70 feet. He almost cleared them, but the KLM's engines ripped through the Pan Am's midsection. The KLM exploded on impact. All 248 on board died. On the Pan Am, 335 of 396 were killed. 61 survived. Most walked out onto the wing through holes in the burning fuselage. 583 people, a missed taxiway, a blocked radio call, and one captain who was so sure he was cleared that he didn't wait to find out.